Hello, everybody. Welcome to VLC's webinar on the future of transport modelling. We have probably about half of the attendees expected, so I might just give it 30 seconds or so, and then we will kick off. I'll just keep an eye on the attendees. I think people are gradually trickling in, so perhaps I'll kick off. So my name is Daniel Verriard. I lead the Sydney team of VLC and work across WA and New South Wales. And I'll be asking questions and speaking with our panelists here, starting with Tim Veach, who's our Executive Director of Technical, Ali Inayat-Hussain, who leads our Future Transport team, and Zara Navidi, who is a Senior Consultant in our Melbourne team. And thanks everyone for joining us. So the structure of the webinar we'll go through today will be around 40 minutes of setting the scene and some question and answer from me to our panelists to explore the future of transport modelling. And you'll notice on the right-hand side of your screen, you'll have a chat box. If you want to ask questions, feel free to do so, and we'll leave 15 to 20 minutes at the end. So please do, as people have ideas for you and things you want to pick up on, please let us know who you'd like to have a follow-up question with, if there's someone in particular, and I will endeavour to ask that at the end. So to kick off, I'd like to set the scene for the discussion. And basically, if you're in the wrong room and wanting to talk about detailed traffic modelling, we're here to talk about strategic passenger transport modelling tools. So the kinds of models where you're covering whole city regions or even states and covering the travel modes like car, public transport, and potentially walking and cycling. So in terms of the future of transport, it helps transport modelling. It helps to think about the current state of practice. And in Australia, the typical approach is known as the four-step model, and that approach dates back kind of 5 or 6 decades, with the basic structure improved and fleshed out over that time. And this kind of four-step model has been used in major planning studies in Australia and internationally to understand how growth in population and employment in our cities will translate to future transport demands, and ultimately how those transport demand translates into vehicles on our networks or people in our buses and trains. The conventional four-step model sequentially computes answers to questions like how many trips will a given location generate and attract? And where will these trips go? How do we join up these two locations for a trip? And then what travel mode will people choose? So whether we go for car or public transport, depending on the costs of each of those alternatives. And then finally, what kind of routes will people take? So that's the kind of assignment step. Will they take the motorway or a highway, or will they take the 320 bus or the railway? And basically, this has been a really trustworthy, reliable model that's been used in a lot of detail. But more recently, there's been a bit of a groundswell of interest in changing this status quo and evolving from this kind of traditional practice. And there's a bunch of motivations for this kind of change. So the first kind of big motivation is that four-step models are seen as not giving complete answers to some of the really important policy questions that we're coming up against at the moment. So things like movement and place approaches to transport and active travel modes that tend to be underrepresented in these kind of four-step models. A real focus about genuinely multimodal transport strategies, shifting people out of cars, for instance, and thinking about a carbon-constrained future. This kind of set of policy questions is quite challenging for the four-step models. A second set of things that we're really interested in these days is about equality and personalised impacts, like drilling right down into who's affected by transport policies and projects. I guess the second motivation for change is about the quite uncertain and rapid evolution in transport supply that's emerging at the moment. So recently we've seen, a big emergence of shared mobility. So your kind of Uber and the increased prominence of those compared to private cars, as well as micro mobility, things like shared scooters, shared bikes, shared electric bikes, that basically 10 years ago they were not around. So they're not really things that we have in our historical models. Similarly, driverless cars a little bit further out into the future, but depending on your viewpoint, they could happen, they might not happen. But in any case, again, we don't have observed travel behavior about how people interact with these things. So our models basically tend not to have an explicit representation of these things. A third motivator is the instability and uncertainty about transport demand and preferences. So we've heard a lot and spoken a lot about COVID at the moment. What that really means for transport models is that we're disrupting established preferences about, if you have a white collar job, you're going to commute to and from work every single day, and that generates a certain number of trips. Some of those preferences are really under threat, but what's the future? Is it going to be as it was yesterday, or is it going to be what it was 5 years ago? What does it look like in 20 years' time? There's a lot of instability and uncertainty there. Another thing, and another tack that people were probably talking about a bit more 10 years ago is the declining license holding and car ownership against for younger cohorts. This is something that, again, do our models reflect that instability or uncertainty in preferences? I guess a final element is probably something more positive about the new opportunities to enhance and supplement the existing modelling tools. So the emergence of a lot of new data sets that are becoming available, so movement and trip data drawn from GPS devices, from mobile handsets. These can give us an unimaginably large sample size compared to some of our more historical data sets. And the final one I just mentioned is the new and improving techniques and computing power. So being able to, via a cloud, access supercomputers is kind of an amazing thing that's become available. Similarly, the emergence of machine learning approaches to model estimation and model training that aren't part of the previous toolkit that we've had. Lots of opportunities there as well. So I guess with that kind of context in mind, I'd like to bring in the first of our panelists. Ali, I guess my question to you is, with all this big data to tell us where everyone is going and maybe what they're doing, do we still need to go through this process of behavioral models?
Yeah, so I think where I'd start with that is what can we use and what can we use data to tell us? And data tells us a lot about the here and now. And one point to make is that in the past, where there's been less data available, within a more of a kind of data poor environment, models have been used not only to tell us about the future and the impacts of different interventions, but also about filling in the gaps in what's happening today. And with the kind of development of new data sets, what we're finding increasingly is that for this use case, we don't need to rely on models so much. But I would also say that data today is probably underutilized, and there's a big chunk of benefit you can get by properly analyzing data, understanding today's context at the problem definition phase of projects before we jump into modeling. But with data, there is also a note of caution I want to sound as well. With the newer data sets that are becoming available, it's increasingly important to understand the strengths and weaknesses of different data sets. A lot of the data sets that are more contemporary, derived from mobile phone handsets and apps and all sorts of places, are not collected primarily for the purposes that we're applying them to. So we have to make sure that we're kind of taking account of that in how we're using the data. Having said all of that, basically, what I would say is that the data alone, however, does not answer all of the questions that we have. It's an obvious point, but it comes up often in the conversation about kind of especially big data, contemporary data. In order to answer questions like what will the impact of a particular policy or intervention be, and trying to look at the future, we need to develop relationships from the data, we need to extrapolate, we need to build behavioral frameworks from the data that help us answer these kind of future questions that we may have. And so overall, the availability of data presents new opportunities and perhaps changes the types of model that we may want to build and the techniques we use. For example, focusing more perhaps on pivoting techniques that use observed data more directly as a starting point, and also other newer methodologies, but it doesn't negate the need for transport models.
Great. Thanks, Ali. And to come back to another issue I raised at the outset, maybe turning to both Ali and Tim this time, given all the uncertainty in demand and supply that I outlined, are we better off developing more complex models, or instead kind of running more diverse scenarios using those existing tools that we have off the shelf? Ali first, maybe. Yeah,
so I guess taking that one first, I would say, based on where we are at the moment, that the answer is a mix of both. Basically, we need to both build, improve our modeling frameworks, and also represent different diverse scenarios in using our existing models. So, if we were to take an example as to the long-term impacts, for example, on working from home of behavior change, given the kind of current COVID focus and looking at the post-COVID world, authorities around Australia, New Zealand, and further afield have been using existing four-step models to offer insight here. So what we may look to do is, for example, change the level of trip making associated with particular segments, so commuting or business or so on, and see and try to proxy an effect of kind of working from home. And in this manner, we can also test lots of other policies. So other examples are on looking at, for example, the supply side effects of autonomous vehicles. Those can be looked at by adjusting capacities. Now, these kind of approaches can be used to understand uncertainty better. We've seen, for example, in New Zealand with NZTA in the past, they've put a lot of thinking into alternate future year scenarios and looked at different scenarios, broad scenarios around how travel costs and the preference for physical versus virtual accessibility will permeate. And with that, they've, for example, shown that the background changes to 2040 in vehicle kilometers traveled could be anywhere between a reduction of 53% through to an increase of 35%. Now, that's clearly a wide range, but it tells us something. And in business case development, we're seeing increasing calls to handle uncertainty better, and we're starting to see the emergence of kind of Monte Carlo simulation-based approaches to test a wide variety of different assumptions. Now, that testing, this scenario testing alone doesn't solve uncertainty, and that's for two reasons. Firstly, because if we need the right behavioral levers in our models in the first place, otherwise we're leaving too much to be handled through assumption, and that risks having also leading to a false confidence in results if we're not careful about how that's presented. Secondly, even with the most comprehensive models, there's just a lot we don't know about the future, and I think that's where also our decision-making frameworks need to adapt, and we need to deal with that quite kind of head-on and in an honest way. And some food for thought from Pilo Williamson, who wrote the textbook that many of us will have studied on transport modelling recently at Modelling World in the UK. He said, there is no evidence that the model that is the most complex and granular over space and time provides the most accurate results and reduces uncertainty. So I guess reflecting on that, I'd be keen to hear what Tim thinks, really.
Yeah, thanks, Ali. Yeah, I agree that we definitely need to take uncertainty more seriously in the work that we do, and I expect governments will expect us to going forward, because I think the level of uncertainty that exists about the future right now is unparalleled compared to what we've experienced in the past. And I think looking at high demand scenarios, low demand scenarios is really important. And as part of that, we're going to need to move. Our traditional approach to dealing with uncertainty is to look at changes in the inputs, like changes in population or fuel price and that kind of thing. But I think we're going to need to start looking at changes in behaviour. The normal practice in transport modelling is often just to hold the behavioural parameters fixed into the future, because it's difficult to do anything else. But I don't think that's going to be good enough going forward. And so we need to start, I guess, researching more what future behaviour could look like. We can't say with any certainty what it's going to be, but the working from home example is a good one, where just saying that it might reduce travel overall by a certain amount isn't good enough, or it's not. We can go further than that, I think, and like there'll be certain industries, certain occupations that are more able to work from home. And so while we may not ever be able to know, we can't say now what proportion of people are going to work from home in 20 years, but we can, I guess, think about which types of people might be able to do it, and we can build that kind of subtlety into our models, so that the key to that is looking at if demand does reduce, where does it reduce, and at what times of the day does it reduce, and ultimately how does that affect our decision making as far as policies or different projects goes. So I wouldn't see that complexity being around improving accuracy. So I agree with Pilo's comment on that, but it's more about understanding the effects that these things could have and using that to help decision makers make better decisions. And a good example might be that if there's a material risk of travel demand reducing in the future, then that would tend to favour projects that improve accessibility rather than just boosting capacity. In that, projects that improve accessibility will benefit people throughout the day, irrespective of the congestion level. And so our decision making may change by grappling with that uncertainty. And probably the last point I'd make as far as the effect that this all could have on model design is that I think we need to kind of revisit our thinking on what we can rely on to be stable over time. Traditionally, we've kind of held, say, trip rates constant into the future. So trip rates per capita might remain fixed in our future forecasts. And I guess one thing COVID's shown us is that trip rates can change. And, a lot of us, not everybody obviously, but a lot of people can work from home now, and may continue to do so into the future. And so trip rates have changed, but activity rates have not changed as much. So while we may not be making as many commuting trips, we are working. And so that kind of supports the view that we should be looking at activity-based approaches to modelling. But it also has implications for the data we collect. We need household travel surveys to look at what people are doing at home, not just the travel that they make, so that we can look at substitution between, travelling versus doing things at home. So, yeah.
Thanks, Tim. And I think that moves nicely to the next point, Zara. I know in the US and New South Wales, for instance, there's a lot of investigation and investment in activity-based models. And it sounds to me like this is definitely an avenue for building that behavioural understanding that Tim was alluding to complement the analysis of scenarios and so on that we're looking at. Can you give us an idea of what you get that is new and different and special about activity-based models?
Thanks, Daniel. I probably start with a quick comparison of the different approaches. First of all, for everyone to be clear, all about the definitions, and also kind of clarify the point that you just mentioned. So the traditional models are usually trip-based, and it means that they focus on single trips from origin and destination, and they ignore a lot about the constraints about that applies to that trips or the person who are doing that. The connection between the trips and everything like that is kind of ignored to a good extent. And then we have tour-based model that looks at that kind of connection between the trips to some extent, but still there is not a lot about who's doing the travel and how, and a lot of the details on that. Both these trip-based and tour-based models are highly aggregated. It's not a given. It is possible to disaggregate them, but then it's about like the added value of that. So they are generally highly aggregated. And then after that, we come to activity-based models, which changes the whole premise of modeling from just, doing the trips to why are we doing the trips, and the fact that those trips are derived from the activities that we need to do, which is, Tim mentioned very nicely that all those things should be carefully considered right now, because not anymore necessarily we travel for work. But again, that's kind of shows the flexibility of activity-based models can include that. After that, we have the activity-based models also look nicely at the chaining of the trips and activities for each traveler, if you like, and they can drop or kind of pick up more trips or less trips. And then we have agent and activity-based models, which is pretty much if we assign a person with the demographic characteristics to that chain of trips in an activity-based model, you would have an agent and activity-based models. Usually these two latter types are highly disaggregated. To some extent, you can look at individuals in coordinates and like seconds of the day. And that brings a lot of possibility to the modeling, which means you can look at the equity on a higher level. You can model modes that were not possible to a good extent before, like demand responsive, very personalized modes of travel, or also the highly segregated. The spatial disaggregation gives you the possibility to look at like finer models like walking, cycling, or scooters, as you were like mentioning in the beginning. Also, agent-based and activity-based models usually come with dynamic traffic assignment. It's not a necessity, but usually they come with a DTA, and dynamic assignments usually have a better representation of the interaction between the demand and supply in the network, which I believe is very important, especially as we go forward in the future and the supply and demand is not as certain as we have right now. So it's good to have a more realistic, let's say, representation of their interactions. Saying all that, so in summary, agent and activity-based models brings a very higher capabilities to answer a wider range of questions. But we should be very careful on what we are designing and how we approach them. It's not a panacea that, okay, they sound amazing, let's have them. We should be careful on how we design and how we use them.
Great. Thanks. And I guess in a halfway measure potentially, Ali, I know some jurisdictions like WA have looked at activity-based models carefully and instead opted for a simpler approach. How much of the functionality from ABMs that Zara talked about can you get with a slightly simpler approach like a advanced tour-based model? I think this picks up a little bit Mikhail Bleemer's question in the chat, so hopefully we can cover that off. Thanks. Oh, sorry, you're on mute.
The kind of rookie error. At least I got it out of the way on behalf of the team. But yeah, exactly. As picked up in the chat, definitely tour-based models do contain lots of detailed segmentation, and that does get you a long way there. And I guess just reflecting a bit on the fact, I'd just like to wind back a bit and say, for a long time in certain markets, including where a lot of my experience lies in the UK, activity-based models haven't gained a huge amount of traction. That's starting to change, but they haven't in the past. And in my experience, that's been because when the case for them has been explored, the cost in terms of development time and in terms of budget required when you kind of trade off against the benefits, the case wasn't always clear. And so, for example, if I take where in my time at Transport for London and look at where the decision was made to go there, is that the latest model that's been built is an advanced tour-based model. And this choice, it's worth caveating that it was made back in 2015, however, but is the main aim of the modeling there was to create a model that was advanced enough to test new policies and improve the treatment of walking and cycling, but still maintaining a very strong capability to appraise new infrastructure and input to business cases. So that means what was the approach chosen was a tour-based approach with detailed segmentation, better linkages to more finer-grained assignment models, including one for cycling, with movability options kind of taken account of with an additional user class to be repurposed later. And look, when I look at the context here in Australia, when we look at what's going on in New South Wales and the STM model there and the direction that WA and Victoria kind of headed at the moment, it's a similar kind of approach, and at least in the short term, and that's with good reason. So much of the case here for the use of transport models is around supporting business cases for infrastructure interventions of one sort or another. And for this case, it's important to have models that can converge and produce stable results relatively quickly and allow us to run lots of scenarios. And as many practitioners will know, this is hard to achieve even in these kind of four-step models. And when you add further complexities, those challenges increase. And so the other kind of lens to look at is, well, where are the gaps in the current capability? You made a good case for that, Daniel, earlier. And if we take some of those in turn, if we look at equity, for example, more detailed segmentation can give us some of the benefits there. And also, as you see in New South Wales, we've got models that already introduce population synthesis to look at individuals in detail. They just don't permeate that detail all the way through all the stages of modeling. And that does deliver a chunk of the benefits of an ABM. Advanced policy testing, in my mind, is more of a mixed bag. So things like working from home and the importance that that's gaining more recently, and also testing things like advanced public transport fare structures. This is where having agent and activity-based models do offer substantial benefits over current approaches by linking things together better. But for things like road user charging, if you had an advanced tour-based model with, for instance, time period choice added, then that would deliver many of the benefits. Walking and cycling, I'd just pick up on that and say agent-based approaches or more disaggregate modeling with highly detailed temporal and spatial resolution, as often is accompanied by these approaches, can deliver more benefit here. But in practice, I haven't really seen that in ABMs. For me, walking and cycling and how well that's done is more a function of how much effort is placed in representing that well. The one place where kind of tour-based models are likely to suffer the most, however, versus more advanced options, are when we're looking at some of the newer technology, when we're looking at demand responsive transit, when we're looking at ride sharing, or even electric vehicle charging. This is where agent-based frameworks and also having the linkage between different trips and activities during the day can offer significant benefits. So what would I say overall? In summary, I'd say that ABMs, a lot of those benefits of an ABM can be achieved using an advanced tour-based model. However, we also need to think about the future and where the practice is going. So, in the US, there's no question of the use of ABMs. They are the standard practice. It's clear that they have more capability, and for me, it's a matter of time as to when we switch to those. And so in reflecting that context, another question we might want to ask is what do we lose by going with an ABM now versus other approaches?
Great, thanks, Ali. That's a lot of very interesting observations to try and further unpack. And I think the chat box for those following along is really challenging us to think about exactly whether we can put all the models perfectly on a continuum or into a box. I think what we're hearing is that it is a very complex picture and one that's full of trade-offs. And I guess be interested to hear your views, Tim, on what you see if you're devising a new ABM framework. What do you see as the trade-offs in developing that?
Yeah, good question. I think the kind of classification of models into like trip, tour, and activity-based is possibly, I mean, it's one dimension by which you can classify travel demand models, but it's only one dimension, and there are other ways you can think, separate transport models into different categories. And obviously, the one that Nikhil picked up in the chat was around demographic detail. You can add more demographic detail into any of these types of models. Temporal detail is another one where you can add different amounts of temporal detail to any of these approaches. And so the picture is quite complicated. There's not 3 types of models. There's actually almost an infinite number of different types of models with different levels of detail in different dimensions. And I guess there's a tension between wanting to add detail into all of those dimensions to answer individual different questions that require detail in different dimensions. So there's a tension between that and things like model runtime, model convergence, the complexity of the model, transparency of it, the time to develop it, the cost of maintaining it and updating it, the data needs that you might have, and these practical considerations are very important. Like as Ali said, with uncertainty potentially playing a bigger role in what we do going forward, we're going to want to test more scenarios, not less. And so model runtime is going to be important. And we all know model convergence is extremely important and is already challenging in the more simpler models that we use. So the need to be able to produce stable economic outputs for appraisal is going to continue to be really important. And we need to not lose that as we go to more advanced approaches. The complexity, I think, is also really important to consider because you need to be able to understand these models if you're going to trust them and rely on them. And we shouldn't take that as a given. And the time to develop, it's not just a cost issue. Like models, if there's a 5-year development program, and in some states in the US, that's what they've embarked on. The models might be out of date by the time they're ready to go, or events may have changed. The requirements of government may have changed by that time. So we need to be a little bit agile, and we also need to prioritize the areas that we add more detail into models, and make sure that we carefully consider how much detail we go into in, I guess, what I would call our workhorse strategic models, the ones that we use for 99% of our applications. So as we add features to answer specific questions, we don't want to create a burden for ourselves when we're doing all the other applications. And so what we might arrive at is potentially not just a single model, but different models that look at different things. You might have your core kind of workhorse model, but then you might have a separate model, for example, that looks at things like micro-mobility and shared mobility, where you need more of a real-time simulation kind of approach. And building that into your workhorse strategic model might be, a real burden when it comes to everything else that you do. But maybe you can treat it as a separate thing and devise some simplistic relationships that reflect the relationship between the supply and demand of those modes, and then build those into the workhorse model. So, yeah, I guess summarizing that, I'd say there are really complex trade-offs in this space, which doesn't make it easy. And it does mean that different agencies might arrive at different solutions because their needs are different, and different countries might arrive at different solutions. So it's complicated.
Absolutely, Tim. I was worried that your video might freeze there and I'd have to cover off your question. That would have been a disaster. I guess that's really good insight into the kind of, I guess, conceptual crossover with the practical here about how you go about developing it. Another dimension, I think, is the software dimension about practically implementing an ABM. So I wonder, Zara, and probably a bit from Tim, are you able to give us some insight into what the software options are and what their strengths and weaknesses might be for embarking on an ABM development? You're on mute, Zara.
No webinar can finish.
Webinar bingo.
Yes. Well, I just wanted to start. Well, as Tim and Ali have already kind of mentioned and talked about, there is no like one single or just a few options. There is infinite options of softwares and also ways of modeling the transport. But here I just want to talk about a little bit more about like what I have more experience with, because I'm sure that not many of us have experience with all the models. I will talk about my experience with MatSim in while I was working in academia and private sector. I think MatSim is an agent-based model more than agent and activity-based model. The chain of activities and everything is considered in MatSim, but is not necessarily that type of like drop or pick of more if you want. But on the other hand, MatSim is also very modular, and you can kind of build in whatever that you want to, if you desire to. That's one probably a strength of it. The other strength of MatSim would be it's highly disaggregated, which I understand that is not necessarily pro for models for everyone, but I believe that gives us some capabilities that not every model has, and it allows for some certain, for example, pricing or personalized type of transport that we have in mind, something which is kind of growing more interest in, something like mobility as a service is something that needs a lot of like highly disaggregated models to be modeled properly. Another thing is that I believe MatSim and like similar approaches are very easy to explain to everyone. In terms of if we want to explain about trip-based model, it's you have to think about origins and destination and explain all the assumptions. But in MatSim, you have agents, you have plans, activities, they travel, and these are the results. Understand it's not that easy, but explaining that to a layperson is much more, much easier. But also it comes at a cost. So for example, runtime is always a challenge with MatSim, and I think something that I read in the chat, which was very on point, convergence is a challenge in there with the dynamic assignment and the kind of way the plans are moving forward. And it's an important point in transport and infrastructure models, because we always look at, the economics of that, and it's important to have a concrete way of assessing the convergence and, being able to assess it and being able to achieve it. And also, well, another thing, which is probably the elephant in the room about MatSim, is the difficulty to operate it. It's not easy. It's not very user-friendly. But I think in time that may be overcome. Yeah, I think that's it from me about MatSim. I think Tim has to say more about ActivitySim probably.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Yeah, so I've been quite interested in ActivitySim for quite a while and been keeping tabs on how it's going. It's wildly different to MatSim. Like MatSim, to be honest, is wildly different to most models, and I'd say that in a good way. MatSim is almost a real-time simulation, whereas ActivitySim. So ActivitySim is an open source package from the US, and it's very much a US style activity-based model. Traditionally in the US, the two most used AVMs were DaySim and CTRamp. And ActivitySim is a kind of open source implementation of CTRamp 1. So it's not like a brand new idea. It's more about a brand new implementation that's in Python. And I've got to say, it's actually a very nice implementation and it's very easy to use. And I guess generally speaking, US style activity-based models, you can kind of think of them as a natural extension of the 4-step model, except that instead of being 4 steps, you might have, say, 10 steps. So there's more things that more behavioral responses that they're trying to model. And they'll replace trip generation with activity generation. And generally speaking, instead of having segments, they'll model individual people. So there's a bunch that's different about them, but there's also a bunch that's the same. And for example, they still have travel zones, they still have time periods. In both cases, they might support more detail in those things, in both the spatial and temporal dimension, but the concepts are the same. And they also make extensive use of discrete choice models based on random utility theory, so that the kind of theoretical underpinnings of US-style activity-based models are very similar to the kind of theoretical underpinnings of traditional four-step models. And so they, to some extent, leverage all the learnings that we've made in the last 50 or 60 years while developing the four-step modeling framework. So probably the last thing I'd say is that while the methods in activity sim and US-style ABMs are, similar and will be familiar to transport modelers, traditional transport modelers, but the complexity is amped up, and so there's more behavioural responses going on, and that means that when you get a particular result from the model, instead of there being 3 possible behavioural responses driving it, or let's say 4, with it could be a trip generation change, or a destination choice change, or a remote choice change, or a route choice change. In these complex ABMs, there's a lot more other possible reasons why you might get your outcome, whether it's a scheduling change or a change in the number of activities or the structure of somebody's activities and how they chain them together. So that complexity is you're adding behavioural realism, but you're adding complexity too, and sometimes that might be worth it and sometimes it might not. And so that's the tricky thing. And I don't know exactly where we're going to land with that. And probably the last thing I'd say with activity sim is just that, US style ABMs, because they are more complex, they've got all these different submodels, they do tend to take a fair bit of time to develop and update, certainly longer than a MatSim model, for example. So that's my summary.
Thanks, Tim. So we've got about 18 minutes left. I wonder if maybe I could get one closing observation from each of you if you had to stare into your crystal ball and see what the kind of next steps over the next few years would be for agencies grappling with future modelling challenges. Maybe Zara first.
I think my crystal ball says that the first thing that each agency should probably look at, it's just my humble opinion, is thinking about a transition plan. Activity and agent-based models, like all the advanced models, if I may call them, are using different techniques and more advanced approaches, different user interfaces, which not all modelers and users are comfortable with. So or even the theoretical and conceptual, ideas behind those models, they all may kind of trigger challenges with the models. So it's very good for each agency to think about, a transition plan to move from a more traditional model to a more advanced model, instead of having a big bang and say that, okay, tomorrow we'll have a model. And I think probably like one example here would be Transport for New South Wales, which is having like different phase of studies on what to do with their models, which is, I think, great.
Tim?
Yeah, so I kind of agree with Zara that, I do agree with Zara that I don't think we can ignore these advanced models much longer. I think the case for them continues to get stronger. The range of things which would benefit from them grows, and I think computing power is increasing. But I guess, as I said before, I just think we need to be judicious about where we add detail so that we don't create models that are too complex or take too long to run or don't converge. And yeah, I think there is going to be a learning curve with these new models, and I think we need to start that. And I don't know whether exactly where it's going to end up. When you look at things like activity sim and MatSim, there are strengths and weaknesses of both. And I mean, to a large extent, the ideas in both were developed before a lot of the recent trends emerged. So maybe something else will also emerge, who knows? But I think we need to be experimenting and prototyping and researching and building capability in this space to affect a transition of the type that Zara is talking about.
Thanks, Tim. Ali?
Okay, so I just want to come back to also a couple of points that in the chat I see Pedro made at the start about acknowledging the weaknesses in kind of some of these contemporary data sources, especially where we don't know as much about them. And to me, that amplifies the need to prioritize collection of behavioral data, of household travel surveys, and to ensure their longevity into the future. And I think that's one area where there's work to do, and we need to innovate more, because I've seen in a number of places pressure to kind of cut those surveys, but without those, a lot of the stuff we're talking about today, we just can't do. So what we need to do is search for ways to add innovation, to improve, to get more value out of those. And in WA, for example, we've seen with Perth's latest household travel surveys, the inclusion of GPS devices, which seek to kind of collect the kind of traditional data we get, plus looking across time. But then there's also further innovation, in my view, required to look at options that look at making more use of mobile phone apps, for example, to carry out these surveys, in order to perhaps it will reduce quality somewhat, but to reduce cost a lot further. And I just want to pick up on another question as well that Marguerite, apologies for pronunciation if that's not correct, but made in the chat, which is around, well, how do you get the best out of household travel surveys to capture uncertainty in the future? And I think that's really interesting, because in Victoria, the Vista surveys at the moment, for example, have been reconfigured to give monthly results to give more review into the pandemic. And I think it impacts there. And in the longer term, we do need some kind of ongoing monitoring, because the first step to capturing that uncertainty is to be aware of it. And then we can seek to develop ways of representing that in our modeling.
Great, thanks very much. Excellent views and thoughts on the future there. So I think we've got about 10, 12 minutes for questions. I'll try and combine where sensible. I had a question from Graham Mounsey and Philip Norman. I think a similar theme really, which is how do we I guess, co-develop the economic methodologies and the, I guess, going further back, I guess, the policy imperatives that I talked about at the outset, along with the modelling tools, so that the modelers aren't sitting in their little dark room developing fancy new models and then spring it on the economists. How do we get that interplay to a constructive point? Maybe Ali,
yeah,
can you jump in on that?
So, look, I think that is about conversation. It's about opening up dialogues. It's about breaking down silos. And in for example, the London context, I've seen through the Department of Transport, they work quite hard to try and bridge that gap through the guidance and through co-developing that with lots of consultation with different members. And I think government agencies have a strong role to play there here in Australia. So rather where we're seeing a lot of kind of development of different capabilities in different states, I think there's more of a need to kind of coordinate and look more widely to try and do that. Look, I don't think there's an easy answer, but it has to be about breaking down silos and injecting more of these viewpoints as we're developing the functionality, rather than as a modeling community kind of going forward with the development of these models and then thinking about appraisal, for example, later.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else want to jump in on that quickly, or we got plenty of questions?
I just guess, to me, when we're thinking about these models, we need to think carefully about the theoretical underpinnings, and certain types of approaches will just be more naturally suited to economic appraisal. So models that have a kind of a proven theoretical ability to converge are going to be really important for that. But I think the other thing is, as we move into these more advanced approaches, it's much more common to be modelling individuals and modelling them in a stochastic kind of way, where individual people do single things rather than splitting them into probabilities of things that do lots of different things. Mm. And that poses its own challenge, kind of simulation noise. And I think we need better techniques for handling that. I don't think, for example, the techniques for handling that in Activity Sim are the best. I think that can be improved. I think it's a stream of research on its own.
Great, thanks. Going straight to the latest question from Jerome Katbagan. I think this is a really interesting question about what should we be doing right now in terms of the suite of modelling, and I feel like it's a theme that others have picked up as well in their questions. So would you recommend that authorities move now and be developing ABMs? And I think it's probably also a question about what they're used for and whether we need to have multiple models. So would we be better off shooting for an ABM that is a single model that is all singing, all dancing and answers all policy questions? Or is there going to be this role to have multiple models where you have a more conventional strategic model and then you have a more scenario, innovation-driven, let's say, ABM? Maybe Zara, do you want to have a crack at that one?
Well, I think there is never an easy answer if we should we should go on and develop an ABMs or no, we did and everything. So it's fortunately or unfortunately, it's not that black and white. I think Tim had a good point when he was talking about the last point, saying that we need to think about prototypes and small steps toward the development of the models. So I think it's good for each agency to kind of think about their needs and what they want and what they are looking in the future, and especially on what's happening for example, an agency in Australia cannot have exactly the same approach as an agency in, for example, Germany or Netherlands, because people have very different behaviors at the moment, so they will have different behaviors in the future and different needs in the future. We won't need as big an bicycle infrastructure in Australia as Netherlands may need in the future. So it's very important, and probably it's important for them to model that more comprehensively now. So I think it's very important for each agency to think about the needs, what is happening currently, and then take a step-by-step, approach onto what should we do in the future and how we should go.
Great.
I'd just add one thing, which is I think there's two ways forward, and I think they probably could both be done. One is to prototype, like you borrow parameters from another model and you just prototype it, you get it running, you can start testing things. And it won't be accurate, it won't be calibrated, but you can start playing. I think that's very valuable. But I think there's also another path which could probably coexist, which is to kind of embark on hybrid models where you take your kind of traditional model, which might be a tour-based or a trip-based, and you kind of work from the start and replace individual components. And the natural first step would be to introduce kind of a synthetic population and propagate that through the remaining aggregate parts of the model, if that makes sense. So you kind of, and then, after that, you could replace that with a tour or activity generation model. And then, so kind of do it incrementally rather than a big bang, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I guess Lindsay Oxlade's question about how do we build a trust in these new models. I guess my opening remarks were really along the lines of 4-step models are so well established, so well kind of understood. Where the strengths and weaknesses are, and they're quite entrenched in things like assurance processes, business case processes. How do you build that kind of wider constituency to trust moving from one established modelling universe to something else? I guess that's maybe the progressive thing that you're talking about, Tim, in gradually expanding, but maybe Ali, do you have any experience and views on that?
Yes, I think there's two things. So we have to kind of, first of all, try things, as Tim was mentioning. We've got to go down that path. The other thing is, when we're thinking, for example, in New South Wales, trying to inject international experience and expertise into the equation so that we can see from places where ABMs, for example, are the practice in the US, for example, that people there are in a good position to kind of advocate and tell us about their own experiences. But the other thing is we have to develop expertise and experience that is relevant to the context in Australia. And that's where I do think that there needs to be a lot more support for smaller scale tests, trials, trying of different components in the fashion that Tim mentioned earlier, chunking things up and demonstrating not just the theoretical benefits of these approaches, but in practice, what are the benefits? And that's where I think there's a lot more work to be done.
Great. Anyone else commenting on that one?
I just like to add like one small thing, which actually Lindsay said herself. I think that kind of collaboration or work between the different disciplines or different agencies within the government would also help, because there are certain capabilities or offerings in activity or agent-based models that is very important for some models or for some purposes, which is not important for the rest. So having that conversation within the same agency would help them to kind of understand and appreciate all the benefits and work for it.
We've just got a couple of minutes, so I'm loath to open a Pandora's box here, but I feel like there's a couple of questions from Michiel Bleemer that are a little bit more technical, and I wonder if I can challenge Tim to come up with a succinct response to his idea of really what your views are of quite what a really nice model might be that you would put together. Like what are the best attributes? So we've got the dynamic traffic assignment combined with the kind of time simulation in the MatSim approach, but how would you put the building blocks together to make a kind of practical model?
I think, to me, like, I love DTA, but my personal view is that it's a very heavy burden to carry if you're doing long-term forecasting. And I mean, one of the things about DTA is DTAs are more sensitive. Like if the demand through an intersection is 10% too high, you get big queues forming. And the reality is we don't know what the demand's going to be in 20 years. And so the more sensitive your model is, the less accurate your outputs might actually be. So I think I'm tending to the view that part of the desire for, I guess, DTA is to better model capacity constraints. And this is, I guess, a view that Michiel, I know, holds strongly, that instead of looking to deal with capacity constraints through a DTA, to look for ways of reflecting capacity constraints in more traditional static models, which have, well-known convergence properties and that kind of thing. And I think the package, or I guess the approach that Michiel's been developing, the stack approach, I am a big fan of. I haven't unfortunately had the chance to use it in practice yet, but I love the theoretical properties. So I think the combination of a more capacity constrained but static or quasi-dynamic traffic assignment with a micro-simulated demand model, whether it's tour or activity-based, I think is a good end state. But I still think there's room for things like MatSim. I think we'll have what I was describing as kind of like the workhorse model, but I think things like MatSim are complementary and can answer different questions, and I think there's value in having both.
Great. Thank you very much. We've probably run out of time for any further questions, but thank you very much to our panel, Tim Veach, Ali Inayat and Zara Navidi, for their thoughts and contributions. Thanks to Andrea Archibald for organising the webinar. It's a lot of work behind the scenes, so thank you very much. And thank you very much for everyone for joining in and providing such insightful questions for the panel to mull over. It's been a pleasure. So have a good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much.